Hi everybody. I had a few of you ask me about boundaries and forming privacy in your garden, so I've created a tick list of things I'm going to talk about in this video. These are my books for research. I do have a few more in different locations all scattered throughout the house. If you want to borrow any books on this topic from me because I've not maybe explained it particularly that great, by all means go for it. I have no issues with that. But I will start as best as I can at the very beginning. So I'm going to use this textbook as a guide to keep me on track. So if I go to the beginning, it starts with trees, hedges, and backgrounds, and then there's various different trees in the picture. And when it comes to boundary hedging, you really want to go for a tree or a shrub. If you're going to go for a tree, try and go for a slow growing or a soft wood so that you can prune it more often. If you prune a tree outside of its appropriate pruning window, you can really harm a tree and a shrub, to be honest with you. So I always say go for a soft wood. You can prune that any year, any time of year, however you like. That is my only big tip. I've put that right at the top there. Softwood, evergreen, shrub or trees, better. A good example is anything in the box family. They typically will start with this as the name. I'm very bad at the Latin here, so I do apologise. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of pretty much every plant here. So I may refer to them by their common names, but in the plant world, we typically try not to use them. But anyway, I digress. So here is a plant that has literally just been pruned and trained to grow into a hedge. Has it told me what plant it is? I probably should have read that page to check before I used it as an example. No, it didn't. That's not particularly helpful. But anyway, in the evergreen department, so these are all types of cypress. Cypress trees are softwoods. They're very, very, very hardy. They are a coniferous hedge. Most coniferous hedge related plants. Oh, look, there's that example I was using before. And it's in the box family. So I did get something right, which is fantastic. They are great. You can just plant them in a row like that. And then over time, you can train it from pruning it to become a nice squared privacy shape like that. You don't just have to do it with cypresses. Cypresses just are really good. You can do it with box plants. So these are different, slightly different requirements in terms of how far apart that you plant them. Some people use japonicas. I can't pronounce the beginning part of that, so I cheated and just went for the end. And then you've also got some down here. Now, I have seen privacy hedging with dogwood. That looked very pretty, really beautiful flowers. And then in the winter, all the foliage falls off and leaves these beautiful, vibrant red stems, which are the seasonal interest for the winter. And then in the spring, these beautiful flowers in an umbel shape. Umbel means umbrella, essentially, to put it into layman's terms. It's a flower that is made collectively of lots of small flowers in the shape of an umbrella. When it flowers, they're very beautiful. So that is another suggestion as well. I've seen and hawthorn, which is a common tree, very low growing tree. In terms of when you think of a tree, I think of, big aces and, it's going to be more of a Japanese maple size. They don't get particularly that large. They're still in the small tree category. But it's something that you can consider. Whether you want this way will take time depending on the variety of tree you choose, as different trees or bushes grow at different rates. But that is something you'll have to consider. So these are just evergreen examples of all different kinds. So here's another one. If it's got a little cross in it, it's one tree, one variety of plants cross another one. So this is this plant crossed with another plant to create this plant. But most leyland cypresses or varieties of leyland cypress are the most common evergreen hedging. that there is, because they are very, very simple. They're very, what's the word I'm looking for? Consistent. They're consistent. So you're not going to have to, you'll be pruning them every couple of months on a routine. You're not going to be, oh, we've had a couple of heat waves, the tree's gone a bit wild because the weather's been great. You're not going to have that problem as often with things in the cypress or the coniferous softwood family. When it says coniferous, we're talking about, you know, like Canadian forests where they've got all those lovely trees, all evergreen, but a bit like Christmas trees, all the same family. A Christmas tree does fit the build as well, but I wouldn't recommend a Christmas tree due to the pines. Even though when it's planted in the ground, the pines won't fall off like they would inside your home, it's still just one thing you'd have to think about. Say, for example, if you've got smaller children, you don't want them running into the tree and getting pricked slightly by a pine. It's not that the pines are, not all pines on pine trees are sharp, but there are varieties where the pines grow more like rosemary, which is slightly more child friendly, I'd say. But it's just something to consider, because even though these are evergreen, they will drop leaves, but it will be intermittent. So it might be a handful of leaves randomly this month and then none for a couple of months, but it will drop the oldest leaves over time. So you will be, if you do choose a pine, you will be picking up pines intermittently, but just not in a big bulk, okay? But that's just for the evergreen hedging. And again, these can go as high as you like. I believe if you go for something like this, your neighbours can apply via planning permission to have you cut your tree if it exceeds 20 feet, or it might be 20 meters, but don't hold me to that, as planning permission and, you know, mandatory orders for privacy and like that, they're still a bit new to me. But that's something you will have to consider. If the hedge gets too tall, that it starts shading out your neighbour's garden. You can have it up to a certain height, that's fine, you don't even need permission for that. It's only when you start shading out more than 40 to 60% of your neighbour's garden that you have to really start thinking about what it is that you have planted. But there is different ways of doing it. So this is all the same type of plant. If I go one page over, these are different versions. So this person's created privacy with holly. Holly is brilliant because you've got male and female plants. So you could plant one male plant here, one female plant here. The female and male plants will both produce flowers, but only the females will produce the berries. And so you'll get that nice interest. Oh, this is what I meant by umbels. As you can see, these flower heads are made up of lots of tiny little flowers. So that's something to... Are they flowers? I hope they're flowers. I've said that now. They could be berries. No, I think they are flowers, yeah. And then those flowers will turn to berries on certain varieties, and the berries will give you contrast against the tree. I see a lot of laurels used to create privacy hedging like this because they are evergreen and hardy. And they have such beautiful... They call it emerald. I like to compare it to, say, a lime, the actual fruit of a lime. It's a lovely colour, and in golden hour, as you can see from this photo, it really does look very beautiful. The only downside is when your plant gets a little bit sad, if, say, we have a heat wave and you've not watered it, or it can't find water and it's been too hot for too long, the foliage will yellow and you'll know it's sad, or it will darken in darker greens, and then you'll have a bit more contrast between what's healthy and what's not. Some people love it. Personally, these look beautiful, but I wouldn't personally choose one. There's other ways of doing it. And the same with the holly. I just think about when it randomly drops a leaf here or two, that leaf, when it dries, it's going to be so sharp and spiky that if you've got children running around, I mean, I garden in Crocs, sometimes really naughtily, flip-flops, and I'm barefoot, and when you stand on holly, you know you've stood on a holly. It's so painful. But there's other ways to do it. So, like, again, this is a different variety. This is a yew. But these can make very beautiful hedging, very uniform. This is more for formality. So you imagine this has to be pruned and shaped regularly. And the plants can't be planted too close together, because if not, it will grow out of control. But here's another example where they've intermittently planted a different variety. So you've got light green, dark green, light green, dark green, just to provide that interest. Still looks beautiful. Personally, I prefer all one uniform. If I'm going to go for a formal garden, I prefer this way over this way, but that's just me. My actual preferred way is something more like this, where you can just get your hedge trimmer and flatten it against your fence as a guide and just go all the way up, trim it nice and flat, but then these beautiful flowers, also in an umbel, will come out seasonally. I prefer it seasonally with something like this. So the green foliage on this plant is evergreen. The flowers will come out early spring, and then it goes back to being evergreen. And then autumn, early autumn, late summer, beautiful black berries, brown, blues, indigos, all will replace the flower heads and feed the wildlife. And so at the end of the season, you can find little birds resting on the little branches, nibbling on the berries. It's very, very beautiful. But it could be a pain in terms of then you're picking up petals. So it's one of those ones where here you'd be picking up sharp holly as and when it falls off. And these are evergreen and they will drop leaves, just not in a big, big bunch. So it might drop, like, for example, my neighbour's holly tree dropped maybe 8 leaves in the last 2 months. But because it was a single leaf, I didn't see that one leaf in the middle of my lawn when I stood on it and punctured my foot, which was not fun. But with things like this, you can make topiaries as well. So when they start growing a bit crazy, you can start pruning and making them look pretty. Now there's other ways of doing it, which I will explain. I just want to make sure I'm not going off topic. No. So I've talked about flowers, so I'm now going to go to trees. But to do that, I need to go back a few pages in this book. She says, I hope it's back a few pages. Or is it forward a few pages? Look at me not being prepared, sorry. It was 192, Megan. 19. Oh, that was the section. Okay, we'll go forwards back this way. So yeah, flowering hedges. So this person has used fuchsia, sorry. My pronunciation, again, I'm going to butcher half of these. And because I'm using a book, I've not been that prepared, and the fact that I've just got a sticky note with certain page numbers to go to. But this person's used a hawthorn. My only thing I'm going to say about a hawthorn is it is deciduous, so it will drop its leaves end of autumn for the winter, and it will have spikes. Hawthorns have thorns on, which is less appealing. So these are all types of deciduous hedging where it will lose its leaves. With these types of plants, you can train them to do whatever you need. Hydrodendria is another beautiful example of an umbel-shaped flower head, which is a large flower made of lots of small flowers. And there's another crimson and gold japonica. I can't pronounce this Latin part up here. I'm so sorry. Not a very good plant person if I can't pronounce the Latin, I know. But you can train them. I mean, people have done roses. Very beautiful. This is another type of viburnum. And another type. I mean, look at that umbel head. Look at that flowering head. I mean, each tiny little one here is a flower. And the whole thing is collectively made up of flowers. Some people choose plants that flower like this, like a wisteria, as these can look really elegant and beautiful. And there's a really good example in a couple of pages when I get to it. We're coming to it now. So here's another example of the formal sort of box hedging. You can prune it to however you need. But for example here, all of these lovely yellow flowers are literally just growing through a trellis. Absolutely beautiful. But this leads me to my next point as well. So if you choose to have something like this, regardless of its height, so let me just go forward one more page, so to the topiary page, sorry. You can create an entire hedge like this and prune it however you need, but it can look quite ugly or boring in the boundary edge. If you don't want the hedge to be the interest or the flower, or maybe the hedge isn't in flower when you want it to be or interesting when you want it, you can put bulbs. These are alliums. Basically, these are in the onion family. These will smell of onions. That's my only advice if you're going to choose alliums. It will smell like you've literally got some red and white onions sitting in your garden. But these you can plant in the ground right at the foot of the tree, the hedge. They'll provide you some interest and it looks beautiful. But the downside to having a hedge that actually grows in your garden but up to your fence is, like here you can kind of see it. And again, you can kind of gauge it from these topiaries. It's very wide. I've seen privacy hedging go as wide as sort of 50 to 60 centimetres. And then you think 50 to 60 centimetres wide is a lot of garden space to give up. Now, you may choose, like here, they've chosen to use a tree. They've removed all the lower leaves off this tree. And because of that, they've then retained all this space here. And if you had a standard household fence, like with the slats going sideways, you wouldn't be able to see underneath the tree. And then this would be above the fence line. Absolutely gorgeous. So that's something else to consider. And then here's more varieties of plants that you can put at the bottom of your shrub line to make sure that everything is how you want it. And that would be great too. And then other things to consider when you get planting like this is if you want something like this, this is going to take a while to train. Do you want this tree to be productive? Because productive trees, you could have it so it fruits like apples. I've got friends that do apple trees. Sometimes it's similar to the Kimberlin Library. Their trees are trained to grow flat in a straight flat line to create fencing and decorative appeal. But then they also produce fruit. I've seen some people in different zones. They do lemons, limes. I do brambles. So in the corner of my garden, I am growing black raspberries, blackberries along the fence line across a trellis to grow wildly to create a bit more privacy for my garden. They are deciduous to choose brambles. Apple trees will be deciduous, so they will drop their leaves in the winter and you will be left with some bare stems. But if you're not using your garden in the winter, is that a problem? That's something that you have to consider. Because to me, that's not a problem. I'm not really in the garden in the winter. It's cold and I like the warm. So that's something that I don't have to consider. If you don't want it to be productive and you just want privacy, something like this, but obviously you wouldn't have a doorway, you'd have a fence behind that. There's things you need to consider as well, which is height and speed of growth. And I say that just as a warning that I think the planning permission is anything about 20, I think it's 20 feet. I don't think it'd be 20 meters. 20 meters is incredibly tall. And I think if your tree was if you had a hedge 20 meters higher, that'd be very inconsiderate to your neighbors. But these will need pruning far more often than, I'm going the wrong way, than something of the likes of this. This won't need pruning at all. You just train it to grow up a trellis that's already there, and you could put the trellis just inside your boundary. And so you've then got this beautiful but these won't be in yellow flower all year round. I've seen wisteria that are pink. They look gorgeous growing up houses, but they're not in flower all year round. So they're things to consider. And then if I go back a couple of pages to the evergreen section here, each tree here grows at a different rate. They grow at different rates, and because of that, some people prefer to transplant their hedges. Let me find a good example. I think it's just one page over here. That's really small. That is going to take a very, very long time to get to this beautiful hedge here. That's a couple of years. I'm not going to sit here and deny that. That's a couple of years. These ones here in this example are very, very small, but they're the smaller the plant, the cheaper it is. And you think if you're creating a hedgerow like that, you're going to need a couple of plants, a good couple of plants. And then you have to accept that not all of them will survive the transplanting. Some plants go into transplant shock. And so that's something else to consider. If you buy larger plants to transplant to create your hedge, that's more expensive. And if you are on a water meter, you have to consider how much water it's going to take to water them until their roots are acclimated to your soil. And what I mean by acclimated is the roots then need to establish into your soil and then dig down deep enough to find their own water source. I've got friends that 6 months after transplanting their hedge, their roots are not acclimated well enough and require regular watering to stop the plants from wilting. But once it is acclimated, even in a heat wave, they don't need to be watered. So that is something to consider. Some people choose a variety that grows really quick, but then they don't think about the fact that if it grows really quick, it's going to need pruning more often. And if you're not going to be the one pruning it, like for example, I have a neighbour that pays a gardener to come and do hers, that's expensive. He's got to come more times per year just to maintain that hedge. So there's a lot to think about and a lot to consider in terms of whether you want it to be just like this one here, really beautiful. This is semi-productive. Obviously, this one's great for birds because of the holly. The birds can eat the little berries, but you'd need to plant a male and a female, or a couple of males and a couple of females potentially, because holly need to cross-pollinate the male and the female to create the fruit. So that's something to consider, but you can get variegated versions. So this one here is a variegated version where it's got these beautiful white, or they could even be cream or yellow margins, which is just the edge of the leaf is a different colour to the inside. Let me zoom in a bit better so you can get a better example. So this little edge here, they call it the leaf margin, and this variegated variety has beautiful margins, but there are plain varieties. Sometimes you'll find that they've grafted a variegated version onto a plain or a standard version, and then sometimes you can have both types growing. That's also really cool. However, over time, what might happen is the non-variegated version, the original plant, grows a stem. That stem then takes over and it can out-dominate the variegated version, and then over time you could lose your variegation if you don't look after the holly or whatever you choose to get variegated. So that is something else to consider. My personal preference in terms of all hedging, I mean, look, here's another example. This is beech. Beech are lovely, but it's deciduous. These will all turn brown October, November time, and you'll have bare stems. So you really do have to consider whether you want that or whether you want something that looks so beautiful, flowers, but then dies back. And again, here's some more examples. But cost is important because these were probably 10 to 15 pounds. And look how they're actually decent size. But when you put them in the ground and you think that you want something like this, that's expensive. It gets expensive there. Whereas the cost of putting, let me go forwards to the carnivorous section again, sorry. This is a lot of page flicking, I'm so sorry. Something here, you wouldn't transplant something that large really, because I mean each one of these is probably 200 pounds, and that's going to need a lot of water. But you can train these and it's great. And again, you can get flick forward a couple more, you can get some really beautiful plants to accompany it. So, I mean, my preferred ways to create privacy hedging are, because I do a lot of veg growing, is productively. So if I was going to do this method, I'd probably do it with apple trees and then have the joy of pulling some apple trees off. And then I can still retain all this space under here for the dogs to play, you know, children to play under the trees. It's not an issue. You're not losing space. Here, you're then required to buy a trellis to grow something up. Something very similar. I bet it's this way, isn't it? Yeah. To grow something like fuchsia or you know, uh, all different varieties. Sorry, I thought that was going to be the viburnum, but it's not. You can train roses to go up, but you would have to put a little trellis there for that to happen. Or even the hydrodendria, you can get it, sorry, hydrangea, you can get that to climb. So it's something to consider. But for a good portion of the time that it takes for it to grow in, your hedge is going to look like how this one does in the picture. And you're going to be able to see where each plant is grown until it gets wide enough to become like this. So this is what it might look like for 4 years, and then on the 5th year it might start to look like this. But they're investments, so definitely invest in what you're going to want long term and not just for right now. Because for example, look at the variegated design on that with the little I'm going to call those lime green freckles. But this is berry forming, but you can't eat the berries on this. Most of the plants that are used standard for privacy hedging are toxic to humans, so we can't eat them. So that's also to consider, but they look very elegant. They look, because of the formality of them, they look so elegant. And here's another example using something from the box family, which is the Buxiaceae family. So there's loads of different ways of doing it. Here's 2 more examples with the little really pretty flowers. So it's whether or not so the things I would consider if I was to put in a second one in my own garden is, do I want it to have seasonal interest in terms of, do I want it to look pretty or be productive? Do I want it to have flowers or fruit? Do I not care? If so, that doesn't matter. Do I want to retain my garden space? So do I want to lose up to 50 centimeters of ground space? Or do I want to keep that space? That's something to consider. And then when you're choosing plants, it's not always best to choose the quickest growing, because the quickest growing means that you're going to groom it more often. That's expensive unless you want to do it yourself. But even if you do it yourself, that's labor intensive. And you've got to have some good arms to keep holding your garden loppers up to chop it down, or you can use a chainsaw or a proper hedge trimmer. But they're the things to consider. And then you've also got the whole point of, do I want it to go so tall and wild that my neighbours then, because it's growing so quick, can apply for planning permission and force me to chop it down? They won't ask you to chop the whole thing down, but they can get a mandated order where you have to say chop 5 feet off the top. That's expensive, and it's going to look very ugly to lose large quantities of the hedge all in one go. So they're the main things to consider. I will show you my tick list again. So I covered why softwood evergreens are good in the beginning when we went to this section. These are all softwood evergreens. And then I've showed you an example here. This is something in the box family, which is my comment here about Buxiaceae plants. I know it doesn't say Buxiaceae, but Buxiaceae, I believe, is what the actual genus, the genus or family is called. The plant family, yeah. I'm going to try and wrap this up now because I didn't realise how long I've been talking. And so things to consider again. Do you want it to flower? Do you want to take up your garden space? Or do you want trees with bare stems, which is obviously I covered when we went to the trellises here. Bare stems. Do you want it to climb a trellis? Things to consider. And then the height that you want it, the speed of which it grows, and whether you want it to produce you food. And whether you want it to be there all year round, or in the autumn you clean up all of its leaves and it stays there. And if I can, I'll try and find an example of like a dogwood, which is what I was speaking about before, because dogwood drops all of its leaves but leaves really pretty, vibrant, red decorative stems. So that's something else that you can consider. But cost as well. Smaller plants are cheaper, but they take longer to grow in, but they require less water. Larger plants require far more water, far more care to establish, but when they're established, it's larger and you are then closer to your goal. So I hope this video helps. I know it's incredibly long, but I wanted to make sure I covered all the points in a detailed enough way that either you feel confident to borrow the books or do some of your own research, but you know what it is more that you need to think about and research into. So I hope this helps, and I'm going to sign this video off here. And if you have any additional questions for me, either comment them on the video or direct message me, and I can make either another video or I can just speak to you directly, because there was a couple of you, so obviously I'm not going to put you all out here on blast. But for example, yeah, these are some of the things that you could do. So let me know. I'm going to sign off now because my stomach's starting to rumble and you definitely don't want to hear that in the background. But yeah, let me know, and hopefully this has been really helpful for you. Sorry about the informal way of doing the video. I'm a gardener, not tech savvy. Well, not tech savvy enough to be doing editing and that stuff, not with videos for YouTube, definitely not. So this has all been filmed in one take, but hopefully it helps.